My name is Heather Sargeant, and I'm the Communication Director for Georgian Bay Forever. Sometimes we call it GBF for short. GBF funds and supports scientific research and education that protects and enhances the waters of Georgian Bay as part of the Great Lakes. I think we all want to see the waters of Georgian Bay and the Great Lakes healthy and thriving for future generations. It was about a year ago today that I first heard that funny word Phragmites at a workshop put on by the Georgian Bay Association and GBF. It got me so inspired and so angry, that's me looking angry, that I decided to do whatever I could to stop this plant from taking a foothold in Woods Bay. I started my own community blog and group, met so many committed and passionate people, some of whom I see today. I did some good things in some wetlands, and ultimately it led me here today to be with you. I hope that you can be similarly inspired. We want to encourage any of you to share your stories, your questions, even your frustrations around Phragmites. If we cannot tackle them all today, they will be noted and we'll be certain to follow up with you. So what is our goal? I think long term, and ultimately we want to eradicate Phragmites from Georgian Bay. As a sort of short-term goal, we want to remove twice as much as we did last year. And when I say we, that was people like you, and many of you here, were able to remove about 8,000 kilograms of Phragmites in over 16 communities. I think it's very doable based on the attendance today to do twice as much. The trick with Phragmites is really having the right plan for the right situation. Obviously, what you see in the one picture is a very different situation and requires a different management technique than you see in the other picture where it's very pervasive. Today, I hope we can all leave today learning how we can contribute individually, as a community, and as a municipality. We have an aggressive agenda today, starting with why is this plant so destructive? We're going to move into the types of controls. Then we're going to break for about 15 minutes or so and break into a municipal group and a community group. And in your handouts, again, I tried to give you a little piece of paper that might help you self-identify which group you want to be in. I can't play this video for you today because I don't have Wi-Fi, but I think it's a very fun one, and I invite you all to check it out. It's sort of a summary of what we did last year. It's kind of a horror video to get you inspired for 2016.
Well, thanks, Heather. It's a good video, and it's getting lots of hits, so yeah, go have a look at it. It's fun. Heather's creativity coming through. Invasive species are alien to the territory that they're in, and they cause harm in that territory. We can have alien species that are amongst us and don't do any harm, in which case we're not that worried. They can learn to play by the rules. But an invasive species is one that actually causes harm, health effects, causes harm to the economy or to the ecosystem. And Phragmites is certainly very high up on that list. If you start looking at the types of damage that that particular plant can do. And when we talk strategies of preventing that plant, we're really trying to encourage the view of, from a financial perspective, of taking early action, because it's the cheapest thing to do. And it's why that we've been out in the community for the last 4 or 5 years, trying to educate folks and really start to take a look at this plant. In locations where nothing's been done and people have just kind of been a little bit complacent, the problem multiplies exponentially. This plant grows at an enormous rate, and we'll talk about that. In communities where we can just start to see infestations happening now, ideally we put the resources to it today, and it means that 5 years into the future we're hardly spending any time. It's just a little bit of touch-up maintenance or keeping vigilant, seeing where that plant is. And I'm using an example of Asian carp as another opportunity for prevention here. If we can prevent Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes in the first place, imagine all the money that we're going to save going forward in trying to deal with them and keep them out. And I'm sure this is another one where everybody's seen those videos of the silver carp leaping out of the water every time somebody goes by in a boat, right? Or sometimes it's simple things that can actually lead to those preventions. Public education is one opportunity for that. But often we need some regulation to kind of put a little bit of meat behind that. So the International Maritime Organization and the U.S. Coast Guard issuance of the general vessel permits in the Great Lakes for shippers, dealing with ballast water back in 2006, when these came into effect, we haven't seen any new invasive species enter the Great Lakes through shipping. Okay, so that was a case of regulation actually having a very, very significant impact. And it may be that municipally we need to come up with similar types of regulations when it comes to, or bylaws, when it comes to selling invasive species as ornamental plants. And miscanthus is one that's currently still being sold, right? And what is it? Going down one road, I actually saw a house that had it planted on their front yard, and it was growing in the ditch, and then it had kind of, you could see it about 2 houses down, growing in the ditch in front of the other house. It's the next Phragmites, so we want to keep aware of that. Early detection, while we have a lot of infestation of Phragmites, this is something that is going to cost a little more money to get ahead of, but we can, and it is possible, and we do have some examples of communities that have gotten right on this and actually had a significant impact on how to get ahead of it. But it does require a coordinated effort. And then late detection are things like sea lamprey. They're already in the system. We spend a lot of money every year, about $30 million between Canada and the US, just trying to knock that down to 90%, or we knock it down by 90%, knock it down to about 10% what it would otherwise be. And we've been doing that since 1958, which means we spent about $1.7 billion on sea lamprey, control. And that's not going to end. That keeps going and going and going. The more invasive species we end up with in this location, the less money as taxpayers we're going to be able to afford to outcompete these things, right? So prevention, key. The problems with invasive species are the reduction in biodiversity. They damage the native ecosystem and habitat for other organisms. And also, they damage the medicines that First Nations use. So these invasive plants come in and have an ecological impact, but they also have cultural and social impacts to First Nations. They reduce the water quality, and being out in many of the locations in Collingwood and hauling these things out of the water, you've got 3 or 4 years of detritus that's just broken down and sitting in the bottom and rotting and taking all of the oxygen out of the water, and it's a real problem for the other native species that are there. Also, things like zebra and quagga mussels are in the bay, and they're harming and fouling water intakes, costing lots of money every year for municipalities and businesses to deal with. And if you look at the massive fish and bird die-offs that we've had as a result of botulinum toxins that come from the quagga mussels, and then the goby eating those, and then our shorebirds and fish eating the goby, we have, tens of thousands of birds and fish have died off because of that. And not to mention that in some cases, like the Eurasian milfoil, if anybody's related to the marina industry, Thornbury, I think, had to actually move their docks out a couple of years ago because of the Eurasian milfoil that was getting in at the same time that water levels were really low. And sailboat keels were just getting stuck in the stuff and couldn't move. So the big thing for me, though, is that they really waste a lot of time and harm the economy. They waste our energy. We could be doing other things that would be positive instead of having to worry about eradication of Phragmites. But eradication today is going to be a cheaper thing to do than waiting for 5 years and then trying to deal with the problem. So Phragmites is very destructive. You've all seen the worst case of it, where it gets to be this 18-foot tall plant. If you're driving down the road, sometimes it only looks like it's maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, but by the time you actually climb down into the ditch and see it, it's way over your head. Strong competitor for nutrients from other plants because it grows so prolifically and quickly. It's also allelopathic, which means it actually puts a toxic chemical out into the soil that causes the other plants to actually inhibit their own growth. They break that gallotannic acid down with the enzyme tannase, produce gallic acid in their own root system, and gallic acid is a root growth inhibitor. So our plants are not really able to compete biologically with this organism either. And we don't have any effective natural controls. The stuff you've seen growing right across the asphalt or up through it in many cases, very prolific grower. It's got the rhizomes under the ground, but also these stolons on the surface of the ground that can go about 85 feet. In fact, if you look at the rate of growth of this, almost half a meter, little over, or just under half a meter in 4 days. of growth. That's the stolon across the surface. So a very significant plant, 2,000 seeds in a seed head. And every so often, as these stolons kind of shoot out across bedrock even, they're sending new shoots up, new growth. So very, very prolific. The historical distribution of the plant, which basically started off in the late 1800s in New England, but it started to spread pretty rapidly because they were planting it as an ornamental grass in many cases. And also the roadways and highways started to open up with the superhighways back after the Second World War. And that mode of transit of this plant just took off. So here's 1950, here's 2010. And if we don't do anything, this is the prognosis for 2030. So we really want to, be winding this map backwards and doing whatever we can do now to kind of get ahead of this particular species. The plant itself is, it grows because it eliminates all of the other competition, and because it grows so prolifically, it ends up in these big monoculture, massive stands of the plant. 200 stems per square meter. And because the invasive plant doesn't break down as easily as the native plant does, after you have a mature stand like this, about 60% of the stems are the previous year's dead stalks, 2 or 3 years, and only about 40% of that stand is actually new growth. So the one little piece of encouragement out of that bad news is the first year we go in and cut, we're cutting 200 stems out of a 1 square meter stalk because we have to remove everything. But the next year, only 40% of it's going to be new. So that means we're only going to have about 80 stems that come up in that next year, which means our work is drastically diminished even by year 2, right? Not to mention other things that we're trying to do. And again, these stands become they become a physical barrier between any organism that goes back and forth between the land and the water. For example, turtles that may come in, they want to get on shore, they want to nest or lay their eggs or use the shoreline as habitat. And you imagine being a little turtle and trying to get back through that particular stand. These things end up exhausted, either going in or coming out. And many times when we're into these large stands, you find lots of dead turtles and things like that. Even in the larger stands down around Rondo Park, dead deer in the middle of these things because they get in the middle of it and they get disoriented and exhausted just trying to bound around and get out of the stuff. So that's an unfortunate reality, but map turtles and blanding turtles routinely found dead in those stands. It's hard enough when you're human, and Lynn Short, who works on Wimblewood Beach up in Tiny, was talking about having a team of students and herself into a stand cutting it. And her husband was kind of they were just taking seed heads off at the time, but her husband was taking a bin up and down and he kept having to call to them, okay, where are you guys now? I've got the bin. Where are you? I can't see you. It gets very disorienting. And we have, our native wetlands with this large degree of biodiversity, lots of plants, and then we end up with monoculture wetlands if we don't do anything. So it's really important to get ahead of this thing. And again, that large stands that may require different types of treatments versus a coastal wetland that only has a few shoots in it right now that may be a lot different methodology that we would use to get rid of it. But you can see this type of plant and the amount of biomass that the Phragmites ends up being. 97% of what's out there is Phragmites. Only 3% are all of the other remaining biodiversity. And of course, there's hydrological alterations and changes to the nutrient cycles and things like that we'll talk about later. So the wetlands are important. We have many reasons to keep them, and not all of them are selfish. Some of them are selfless. We want to keep wetlands as a space for organisms that have evolved there to live, right? They need their own space to live. But also they do impact, our fresh water that we use for drinking. And in Georgian Bay, we're extremely lucky. The amount of, processing that we need to do on our drinking water is minimal because it's a very, very clean source to begin with. And so it's cheaper for us to get water than it is in other locations where the water source is very highly contaminated. And think about the Toledans in 2014 that completely lost their drinking water. In Toledo, 500,000 people lost their drinking water because toxic blue-green algae blooms. 2 years ago, right? That's on the Great Lakes too, but very different up here. Climate change is already having an impact, and Mayor Cooper showed some slides from the NASA study. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Cities Initiative, Georgian Bay Forever, and NASA were the groups that were doing that study. And the slides that she showed were from two different time periods, 1987 and 2013. 1987, of course, was when water levels were almost at just coming off their all-time ever recorded high. And 2013 was we were just rebounding off the all-time ever recorded low. So about 6 feet of difference between those two water regimes. And if you get rid of all of the land classifications except the wetlands, and then we'll do a little bit of mathematical processing to make it easy to see what I'm talking about here. Anywhere where you see red, we lost wetlands as the water levels dropped. And anywhere where you see blue, we gained wetlands. Now, I know Dave will talk about it, but specifically if you look down in the Collingwood coastline, you will see some blue in certain areas where we actually did gain wetlands as the water levels dropped. But predominantly, we lost. And the net result was in the south part of Georgian Bay, and you can pretty much go from Parry Sound to Tobermory, 10% of wetlands disappeared in that water level decline. And about 7% emerged in the north part of Georgian Bay. So if we have Phragmites coming into our southern Georgian Bay wetlands, and they take over 30, 40, 50% of them, and we have the ongoing continued expectation of declining water levels through the long term because of climate change, taking away another 10 or 15%, you could be looking at half of the wetlands disappear if we don't take action. So it is important what we're doing, arguably even more so in the southern parts of Georgian Bay. So the net result there was a 3.8% loss of wetlands. But as I said, we don't want any more of those to go to Phragmites. That's enough. That's enough all by itself.